You're overstriding. Right now, today, on your last run, you were overstriding. And that's not an opinion. That's why your knees ache by mile 4 and your 10K time hasn't budged in 8 months. Sit with that for a second because I know it stings a little. You've done the mileage. You've bought the shoes. You've watched the slow-motion arm swing videos filmed on some beach in California. And you're still stuck. Same pace, same wall. Same frustration, lap after lap, week after week. So let's stop pretending more miles is the answer, because it isn't. Not for this problem, not even close. Here's the reality check, and it's going to feel uncomfortable before it feels useful. Researchers at the University of Wisconsin studied runners' stride mechanics and found something most weekend warriors never hear from the guy at the running store. When your foot lands too far ahead of your center of mass, it acts like a brake every step. You're literally slamming the brakes on your own forward motion, then trying to accelerate again. Thousands of times over 10 kilometers. That's not fatigue from distance. That's fatigue from fighting yourself, stride after stride, for 6.2 miles straight. Nobody trains for that because nobody tells you that's what's happening. Quick question for you. If your foot is braking every single time it hits the ground, how many brakes do you think you're applying over one 10K? Take a guess. I'll give you the number in a second, but sit with the discomfort of not knowing, because most runners have never once asked themselves that question. Here's a number that should annoy you a little. Elite distance runners average around 180 steps per minute. Not because some coach pulled a magic number out of thin air, it's because that cadence naturally shortens the stride and pulls the foot strike back underneath the body, cutting down on that braking force we just talked about. Most recreational runners, they're sitting around 155 to 165. Doesn't sound like a huge gap, but stretch that out over a 10K and you're talking about hundreds, sometimes over 1,000, extra brake and reaccelerate cycles that elite runners simply never deal with. That's the answer to the question I asked you 30 seconds ago. You've been braking, on average, over 1,000 more times than the guy who beat you at last month's race. And you thought it was your lungs. So why does nobody tell you this? Because run more, run harder, sells better than fix your cadence. It's uncomfortable to admit the problem isn't your VO2 max, isn't some genetic ceiling, isn't a lack of grit. It's the way your foot is hitting the pavement 40 times a minute, every single run. And here's where most runners get it backwards. Common sense says a longer stride equals more ground covered equals faster times. Makes sense on paper, right? Except it's almost the opposite of true. A study out of Iowa State University found that runners who were coached to overstride, deliberately lengthen their stride beyond their natural cadence, showed a measurable spike in impact forces traveling through the tibia, the shin bone. More reach per step doesn't mean more speed. It means more impact, more braking, more energy leaking out of every stride before it ever gets you forward. The runners covering ground fastest usually aren't reaching further. They're turning over faster, landing closer to their hips, and doing it with almost boring efficiency. Let's talk fix, because I promised you this isn't going to sound like a physical therapy manual. You don't need to overhaul your entire form. You don't need a gait lab, and $600 you don't have. Here's what actually works on your next run. Don't think about your feet at all. Think about your hips. Imagine your hips are being pulled forward by a string gently from your belly button. That's the whole cue. It naturally shortens your stride and pulls your foot strike back under your body without you consciously micromanaging anything mechanical. And that matters, because the second you start controlling foot placement mid-run, you tense up. And tension is its own kind of break, just a quieter one. Try this on your next easy run. Count your steps on one foot for 20 seconds. Doesn't matter which foot. If you land somewhere in the low 40s, you're probably sitting around that 155 to 165 range. The range quietly working against you every single run. You don't need to force your way up to 180 overnight. That's actually a mistake a lot of runners make once they hear this stat. They try to jump straight to elite cadence in one session and end up feeling awkward and choppy. Don't do that. Even a 5% increase, according to biomechanics research out of that same Wisconsin lab, meaningfully reduces impact loading on the knees and hips. 5%. That's maybe 8 or 9 more steps per minute. That's the whole ask. Small, boring, repeatable, and it works. Now here's a cliffhanger for you, because there's a second piece to this that almost nobody talks about, and it's going to reframe everything you just heard. It's not just about how many times your foot lands. It's about how long it stays on the ground each time. That's called ground contact time. The number of milliseconds your foot spends touching the pavement before it lifts off again. Elite marathoners typically clock in somewhere around 150 to 180 milliseconds of ground contact. Recreational runners often sit well above 250, sometimes closer to 300. That's not a small gap. That's nearly double the time your foot spends stuck to the ground, absorbing force on every single stride. And here's the kicker. The longer your foot lingers on the ground, the more that braking force we talked about earlier gets to act on you. Cadence and ground contact time aren't two separate issues. They're the same problem, viewed from two angles. Fix your cadence with that hip string cue, and your ground contact time tends to drop right along with it, almost automatically. You don't need two separate drills. You need one cue that fixes both. Let's get real for a second, because I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like a lot to think about mid-run. Fair. So here's the actual homework, stripped down to almost nothing. One run this week, just one, where for the first 10 minutes, you do nothing but that hip string visualization and count your cadence once, briefly in the middle. That's it. Not every run, not forever. Just enough reps for your nervous system to start recognizing what a slightly faster turnover actually feels like in your body. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about form cues. They're not something you think about forever. You groove them in over 2-3 weeks, and then your body just starts doing it without the mental script running in the background. That's when it actually sticks. And here's a stat that might change how urgent this feels to you. A study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine found that runners who increased their cadence by even a modest margin experienced a measurable drop in loading rates at the hip and knee joints, the exact loading pattern associated with common overuse injuries like runner's knee and shin splints. So this isn't just a speed conversation. This is an, are you going to be able to keep running in 5 years without your knees filing a formal complaint conversation? The 2-second cadence check you do on your next run might be doing more for your longevity as a runner than any foam roller you own. Here's the part that's going to sting, in a good way. You've probably blamed your 10K plateau on 100 different things. Not enough speed work. Not enough sleep, bad weather, the wrong shoes, maybe even your age quietly in the back of your mind on the bad days. But what if it was never about how hard you were pushing? What if it was about how you were landing every single time you pushed? That's the moment right there. You don't need to suffer more to run faster. You need to stop braking against yourself for 6 miles straight, over and over, without knowing it. That's the whole revelation. It's almost annoyingly simple, and that's exactly why nobody talks about it. Simple doesn't sell supplements. So here's what I want you to actually do. Not someday. Your next run. Count your cadence for 20 seconds. 1 foot, honest count. Then run the string through the belly button cue for 10 minutes and notice where your foot is landing relative to your hips. You are going to feel it immediately. It's going to feel slightly weird, slightly too fast, slightly uncomfortable in that wait. Is this really it kind of way? Good. That discomfort is the data. That's what change feels like before it feels normal. But cadence and ground contact time are only half the story. Because there's a runner out there who solved every piece of this puzzle decades ago, and somehow still moves like the ground owes him nothing. You've seen the clips. That effortless glide, mile after mile, marathon after marathon, like he's barely trying while everyone else around him is falling apart. Next episode, we're breaking down exactly what Eliud Kipchoge does differently. 3 specific concrete things anyone, and I mean anyone, not just elite athletes, can actually steal from his technique. Not theory, not vague inspiration. Actual usable mechanics you can apply on your very next run. If this hit home, do me a favor. Hit subscribe so you don't miss that one. It's going to change how you watch every race replay you've ever seen. Drop a like if you're already thinking about your cadence right now, because I know you are. Comment where you're watching from. I actually read every single one. Share this with the running buddy who overstrides and refuses to admit it. And if you want the full breakdown, the training plans, the deeper technique work, the membership link is pinned in the comments below. See you in the next one.